Boatworks today is sponsored by Total Boat and Alexial Yacht Coatings, as well as supported by the generosity from the beautiful folks over on Patreon. Thank you so much. I think I'm feeling better. So welcome back, everybody. Hope you're all doing very, very well. My name is Andy with Boatworks today, and this week I'm going to be going over something that I think is going to be helpful to an awful lot of people, specifically when you're planning out a project and you're trying to figure out how much of a particular type of material you should be having on hand to do whatever it is you need to do. So with that said, let's get started. So over the past few weeks, the number one question that I've been getting based on the last couple of videos that I put out is, how much filler did I actually have to add to the epoxy to get it to the consistency that I was looking for? And to be quite honest, up to this point, my answer has always been, well, you got to go by how it looks and how it feels. You mix it to a certain consistency, and that's true. And that's great, providing you have an understanding of what that consistency is supposed to look and feel like. So what I'd like to cover this week is actually break it down and try and quantify a specific ratio or percentage of how much filler needs to be added to epoxy in order to get to a certain consistency that you're looking for, depending on what it is that you're looking to do. Now, in general, there's three different types of consistencies that are generally referred to, I guess, when you're talking about epoxies, or polyester resins, I guess. And that is basically a catch-up consistency, which is going to be the loosest or the most loose of the three consistencies that I'm going to be talking about. Now, where that type of mixture comes in handy is when you're looking to fill voids, right? Well, let's just say, for example, you lay up some coring material, like on this transom that we're going to be dealing with here. But you get the coring material laid up, you get it in place, and you let everything cure. You come back the following day, and you see all along the top edge, or even just in spots here and there, that there are gaps where the coring material didn't make full contact with the substrate that you were laying it onto. Let's just we'll call that as the void. Now, where this catch-up consistency is going to come in handy is because it is fairly loose. You'll be able to either pour or inject this in to those void areas, and it'll be loose enough where it'll be able to flow down to wherever it needs to go and fill up those cavities, so that you're taking up that space and making the void go away. Now, while you could also do something along those lines using just regular straight epoxy, just unthickened, it's not as good. Anytime you're adding any type of a filler to a resin, you're giving it more structure, you're giving it more body, which is, at the end of the day, is going to give it more strength. So when you're looking to do something like this, it's really a good idea to try and add some filler to it. Even if it's just a little bit, it's better than having none at all. Now, the second type of consistency is I'm going to refer to as like mayonnaise based, because we're all familiar with ketchup, mayonnaise, and what I'm going to be referring to in this next one. So anyways, mayonnaise consistency is the kind of thickness that I'd be looking for if I'm going to be laminating something, specifically like if you're going to be laminating plywood onto something or plywood onto plywood. Now, this isn't so much of an issue when you're working with, say, like a material like Kusa, because Kusa doesn't really absorb anything, but plywood or balsa, any type of a natural product does. And the consistency here is obviously it's going to be thicker than ketchup, so it's going to be fairly thick, but still somewhat loose. And the reason you'd be looking for something along these lines is because wood, in general, we're just going to refer to that generally, is a natural product. It absorbs stuff, whether it's moisture, resin, whatever it may happen to be. So if you're laminating two pieces of plywood together and you have that mixture really, really thick, granted, it will stay in place, but what could potentially happen is when you press these two materials together, the plywood has the possibility of pulling that epoxy out of your mix and leaving you with kind of a dry bond between these two things. So when you're laminating this mayonnaise consistency, you want to have it wet enough to where the plywood can absorb some of that epoxy, which you do want it to do, but you don't want to be left with kind of a dry bond. So by leaving it a little bit on the wet side, it allows for that absorption, but still leaving plenty of epoxy within that bonding seam to make sure that everything stays stuck. And the final mixture is going to be referred to as peanut butter consistency. Now, obviously, this is going to be the thickest of the three. This is kind of what you're going to be shooting for if you're looking to basically get some build, whether it's with fairing material or you're just like what I was doing a couple weeks ago. When you're just looking to get some build, get some thickness on a surface. You want it thick enough to where when you lay it up, even if it's on a vertical or upside down inverted surface, it's going to stay put. It's not going anywhere until it cures, and it's not going to run away on you. Now, each of these consistencies are obviously going to require different amounts of filler, and that's really what I kind of wanted to break down this week, just so when I'm working with people, I don't know if this is more for me, I think it's going to be helpful for a lot of people as well, as I mentioned, but so when you're looking at a project, you can say, okay, well, I've got so much square feet that I need to try and build on, whether it's going to be laminating or fairing or getting some build, whatever it may happen to be. I'm hoping that this will give you a better idea as far as how much of a particular type of filler you should be ordering for whatever it is you need to do. Because I'll tell you, nothing sucks more than getting, say, half, 3/4 through a project or a layup and figure out that you're short. And you've got to put everything on hold for a week or however long it takes for a new order to come in. So let me flip the camera down and let's start getting this ball rolling. Now, when you're talking about thickening your epoxy, there are a few variables that come into play here. And the first one being the actual type of epoxy that you're using. Now, as you can see here, I'm using a 2-to-1 mix. And the reason that's a bit of a factor is that 2-to-1, well, there's 2-to-1s, 3-to-1s, 4-to-1s, and 5-to-1s. Now, the reason that's a factor is because, generally speaking, your 5-to-1 epoxies are going to be thicker than their 2-to-1s. So, just kind of thinking that one through, that should also equate to having to use less filler to get to a certain consistency. Now, the second variable or factor that comes into play here is going to be the actual temperature of the resin. As we all know, and I've mentioned this before, the cold epoxy or cooler resins are going to be thicker viscosity than those that are warm. So if you can take the resin, it may be thick when it's cool, all of a sudden you warm it out, or you warm it up, and all of a sudden that viscosity has changed, sometimes dramatically. And the third variable that comes into play when you're talking about this is the actual type of filler that you're using. Now, there are a handful of fillers out there, but I would say probably the 3 most commonly used are going to be your milled glass fibers for adding some strength and body to a particular mixture, your glass micro balloons. Now, this is something that you're going to be using if you're looking to make like a DIY type of fairing compound. And lastly is going to be silica or Cabasil. I think they're the same thing, just different trade names, I believe. Now, for this demo specifically, I'm going to be focusing on silica because, well, even if you're using either one of those 2 other fillers, the milled fibers or the balloons, there's still going to be a component of that mixture that's going to contain silica, just because silica is what really tightens up the mixture. So silica on its own, even if you didn't add any other type of filler, silica by itself is a very, very good filler to use. It's just because it's a good general all-purpose type of filler. You can use that for everything from doing bonding or laminating to creating fillets for laying up your glass on corners to, well, really pretty much anything. So like I said, for this demo, that's what I'm going to be focusing on because it is the most widely used filler. Now, before we start doing any mixing, I want to weigh these 3 cups. Now, I poured 4 ounces of the base component of epoxy into each of these, but I'm sure there's still going to be some differences between each of these cups. So to get started here, I'm going to put in an empty cup. I'm going to zero out the scale. This is all going to be in grams. And cup number 1 is coming in at, what is it, 151 grams? I can't read this upside down. Yeah, 151 grams. And cup number 2, 152 grams. 145. I think I'm going to add just a little bit more to this third one here, just to try and keep them all within kind of a gram of one another. So now, although the epoxy that I'm working with here today is a 2-to-1 mixture, it's mixed 2-to-1 by volume and not by weight. I mean, you can go ahead and mix this out by weight. It might actually be a little bit more accurate, but it's not, when you do it that way, it's not a true 2-to-1. Like, for example, if you poured out 100 grams of resin, you're not going to pour in 50 grams of hardener. I forget what the specific exact or ratio or numbers are. I'm sure if you go over to Total Boat's website and look up the product for this epoxy, you'll see they'll state kind of what those actual numbers are if you're going to be going by weight. But for here, I'm going to be going by volume. And since I just poured these out, it's a little cool in here. It's 63 degrees. I'm going to set these over on top of a heat register for probably half hour, 45 minutes or so, just to let them warm up, thin out a little bit, so that it's going to be more realistic, I guess, if we're going to be doing this mixture, say, in like the summertime or even late fall or early fall, depending on where you're at, I guess. All right, so I figure while I'm waiting for the resin to warm up, I'm going to go ahead and pour out the hardener here. Now again, I poured out 4 ounces of the base resin, so that means by volume I'm going to go with 2 ounces of this hardener. And again, as always, I'm using the slow hardener. So let me zero this out. Okay. So that's 2 ounces of hardener, and that comes in at 67 grams. And I'm going to be pouring the same volume of hardener into each of the 3 mixes. Okay, well, the epoxy is definitely warm. It's about the consistency of water. Let's see, let's try and get an actual temp. It is 97 degrees. So we're in good shape. Now, I'm sure because this is a fairly thin layer in the bottom of the cup, I'm sure it's going to start cooling off fairly quickly. I did crank the temperature up in the building, so I suspect by the time we're all done mixing here, the temperature is going to land somewhere around 75, 80 degrees, give or take. Typical summer day, well, at least for around here. So, now, a word of caution before I start, I guess, digging into the silica. Anytime you're going to be working with this stuff, you are definitely going to want to make sure that you're wearing a respirator. This stuff is so light and fluffy. I mean, you look at it sideways, it's going to start floating around in the air on you. So respirator, even if you're going to be working outdoors, and if you're going to be trying to do this outdoors, you may want to make sure it's not windy outside. So unfortunately, there really is no sexy way to go through this mixing process and still have it be interesting. So I'm going to kind of buzz through this, but before I do that, I am going to explain kind of the process that I'm using here. Now, I zeroed out the weight on this cup. This little cup is what I'm going to be using for scooping the silica into the actual resin of the epoxy. Now, I'm going to start by pre-thickening the resin with no hardener. I'm not going to get it to the finished thickness, but I'm going to get it about half, maybe 3/4 way there. And then once I get to that point, then I'll add in the rest of the hardener, give that a good stir, and then at that point then I'll continue this process of measuring out and adding the silica until I get it to the consistency that I'm looking for, and it's just a well incorporated mix. Now, one little tip when you're trying to mix in silica is it's so much easier to work in smaller volumes than it is in large. Like, for example, if I knew that I was going to need 12 grams of silica in a given batch, it's better to add it in 4 batches of 3 rather than dumping in all 12 grams at once, because as you're stirring it, it just takes forever for it to get incorporated into the resin. So smaller batches incorporate faster than single large batches. All right, now this is the ketchup consistency, and this is really kind of what I'm looking for. Again, I want to keep it on the thin side so that it's able to actually flow out and go where it needs to go if you're trying to, I guess, fill in some hidden voids. So I'm going to go ahead and repeat this process, keeping track of how much silica I'm adding for each type of consistency that I'm going for. And when I'm happy with each mix, then I'll show you pouring it out on these little panels so you can get a better idea of how thick or what the viscosity of these different consistencies actually are. So it's been about 45 minutes. On the left is the peanut butter, middle is the mayo, and then here is the ketchup mix. Now obviously I couldn't prop this one up because it would have just run right all over my bench. Now this mayo mix actually turned out perfect. It's still thick enough where it's not going to just literally run out from everything that you're trying to laminate together, but yet it was thin enough to where there still would have been plenty of epoxy left over for absorption and still left you with an excellent bond. Now this peanut butter mix, this stuff ain't going anywhere. I mean, that'll stay there all day. Well, it's been there for 45 minutes and it hasn't moved. So we've done our 3 mixes. Now, before we can start crunching some numbers, there's one more key piece of information that we need to have, and that is specifically how many grams of silica are in a brand new bucket of silica. In order to do that, I need to deduct the weight of an empty bucket. So back over to the scales. And I'm just putting this here to hold the main bucket up. So hopefully you're still able to see the digital readout here. So it looks like we landed on 186 grams. Zero that out. So we're trying to do like for like here. We're looking at 226 grams of silica in a brand new gallon-sized container of silica. All right, let me grab a calculator, crunch some numbers, and I'll be back in a bit. And we're back. Now, hopefully I did my numbers right. I think I did. I can pretty much guarantee that if I didn't, someone's going to be pointing that out to me, and that's all right. I've never been a real serious numbers guy. Now, before I get into that, there's two things that I want to kind of bring up because I'm going to be making reference back to these as we're going through the numbers here. The first one being a 1 gallon epoxy kit is actually 1.5 gallons by the time the hardener and the resin are combined. So a 1 gallon kit consists of 1 gallon of the base as well as a half gallon of the hardener. So this is my second time recording, or actually my fourth time recording this, because every time I tried to explain this, it just got really confusing. So keep that little detail in mind. And then second is going to be the actual weight of the brand new gallon of, or tub. I'm just going to, instead of saying gallon of silica, I'm just going to say tub. But tub, I'm referring to a gallon size container of the silica. But I'm just going to call that a tub, all right? So the weight of the tub of silica was 226 grams, all right? All right, keep that in mind. Here's the numbers. Now, looking over the different consistencies that we did here, when we're looking at the ketchup consistency, now for that, I used a total of 11 grams of silica in a 6-ounce batch of epoxy. So that came out to 4 ounces of the resin and then 2 ounces of the actual hardener, giving me 6 ounces total. Now, again, keeping in mind that an entire tub of silica weighed 226 grams, if we take that divided by the 11 that we used in this consistency, that means we could replicate that size batch about 20 times. So when it's all said and done, we would be able to get a total of 100, well, here the number was actually fractional. We'd be able to get 123 ounces of mixed epoxy. Again, you know, the resin and the hardener, 123 ounces of mixed epoxy by the time that one tub or that single tub of silica would be used up. Now, when we're looking at the male, again, obviously thicker, we used 15 grams of silica in a 6-ounce batch. So that means, you know, taking 226 divided by 15, that means we'd be able to replicate that size batch to this consistency about 15 times. So if we did 15 6-ounce batches, that would give us a total of 90 ounces of mixed epoxy to this consistency before the entire tub of silica was to be used up. Now, essentially the way that breaks down, it's about half of a 1 gallon epoxy kit, because again, a gallon kit of epoxy is actually 1.5 gallons total. So in order to use up the entire epoxy kit of 1.5 gallons, we would need roughly 2 tubs of silica for this consistency. Now, going down to the peanut butter, again, as you would guess, used even more. So we used a total of 22 grams of silica in the 6-ounce mix. So that means, you know, taking 226, the weight of a whole tub of silica, divided by 22, that means we could replicate to this consistency roughly 10 times before an entire tub of silica was used up. So after one tub of silica, we would have roughly 61 ounces of mixed epoxy to this consistency. So again, in order to use up an entire epoxy kit, which is 1.5 gallons, we would need roughly 3 tubs of silica to use up that entire epoxy kit. All right, now personally, I find this kind of stuff interesting. Maybe I'm just weird, I don't know. But I find this stuff interesting. I like to be able to quantify things. So at the end of the day, what's the takeaway here? Well, most likely on a project where you're going to need to be working with some thickened material, most likely you're going to go through more silica than you anticipate you're going to need. So I guess kind of a general rule for myself going forward, I would say for every gallon kit of epoxy that I get, I would just plan on right off the bat getting a minimum of 2 gallons of the silica, potentially 3. 3 might be a little bit overkill, but 2 at a minimum. That way you would have the material on hand to do a fair amount of peanut butter consistency mixes. And for the most part, you would be well set for doing a lot of your laminations, like for laying down coring material or that kind of a thing. So 2 gallons of the silica per gallon kit of epoxy is kind of my general rule that I would say going forward. And with that said, I think I'm going to button this one up. So as always, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found this interesting and helpful. And if you did, hit that thumbs up button. If you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Thank you in advance. Appreciate it. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to leave those down below. I'll do my best to get back with you. And as always, thank you for your time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week. I better not be sick. Have a great weekend.
This has been a Boatworks Today production.